You are about to hear something no one alive should know. In the quiet hills of central Illinois, beneath the rolling prairie grass, lies a secret that has slept for over a century. A truth so dark, so meticulously hidden, that even the church itself has tried to erase it from memory. Between 1847 and 1862, 17 young men, priests and seminarians of Sacred Heart Seminary, vanished. Not by accident, not to distant parishes. They disappeared, swallowed by a carefully orchestrated darkness. And what I am about to reveal tonight will show you that the world they entered seeking divine purpose was instead a trap designed for exploitation, corruption, and murder. Sacred Heart Seminary was more than a school. It was a fortress of faith, a place where young men believed they were called by God. Yet within its walls, a different hierarchy ruled, a hierarchy that preyed on innocence, wealth, and ambition. The men running the seminary were not priests. They were imposters, men who had murdered the true clergy and assumed their identities. For 15 years, they conducted operations so secretive, so calculated, that the church's own records were altered to hide their crimes. Hidden beneath the chapel floorboards, letters and correspondences reveal a trade in young men's lives: abduction, coercion, and human trafficking. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic, strategic, and terrifyingly effective. Imagine being a young man, filled with faith, intellect, and devotion, entering a place meant to guide you toward God's purpose, only to find yourself under the control of predators who spoke in a language of piety while practicing the laws of cruelty. They selected their victims carefully, strong enough to endure labor, compliant enough to obey, wealthy enough to make the families pay. And they ensured that the world outside the seminary, the law, neighbors, even the local bishops, would never know what was happening behind those soaring Gothic walls. This is more than a story of disappearances. It is a blueprint of manipulation, a study in how institutions can conceal the grotesque beneath a veneer of sanctity. Every ritual, every prayer, every lesson was a tool of control. And as you listen, you will begin to see patterns in our own world today, ways in which power cloaks itself in virtue, hiding horrors in plain sight. If you are ready to step beyond the veil of comfort, to see the machinery of deception at work in one of America's most sacred institutions, then lean in closer. Because once you understand what really happened at Sacred Heart Seminary, you cannot unsee it. You will know too much to understand how 17 men could vanish without a trace. We must first understand the world that allowed it. The year was 1847. America was raw, chaotic, and hungry for opportunity, but also a place where suspicion and fear festered. Waves of Irish immigrants, escaping famine and death, poured into cities like Chicago, Milwaukee, and Detroit. They carried with them devotion, resilience, and culture, but also an invisible mark. They were outsiders. Protestant mobs viewed them as a threat, their Catholic faith deemed foreign, un-American, dangerous. Entire neighborhoods burned. Churches were torched. Priests were attacked in daylight. In one infamous riot in Philadelphia, 13 were killed, dozens wounded, and fear became a daily companion for every Catholic family. It was a perfect storm. The church needed priests who could navigate both worlds, educated men, devout but American-born, able to soothe the anxieties of a hostile society. Sacred Heart Seminary was born to serve that need. A grand experiment on 400 acres of Illinois prairie, 40 miles southwest of Chicago. Its design was magnificent. Gothic spires, towering windows, hand-carved pews imported from Bavaria, and a bell tower whose toll carried across the flatlands. The seminary cost $40,000, a fortune, funded entirely by devout, wealthy families who believed they were investing in the spiritual future of their sons and their faith. Yet this grandeur concealed something far darker. Behind the polished wood and gleaming gas lamps, a hidden operation was taking shape. Father Edmund Walsh, the towering figure of authority, arrived from Ireland with letters of recommendation from bishops and claims of extraordinary academic achievement. Alongside him were Thomas Murphy and Patrick O'Brien, equally imposing, equally brilliant, or so it seemed. Every gesture, every word, every lesson exuded spiritual authority. But beneath the veneer of piety was a meticulous control system. Students were chosen for obedience, for wealth, for isolation, qualities that made their disappearance easy to orchestrate. And make no mistake, the seminary was designed as a fortress of secrecy. Students could rarely leave. Letters were censored. Visitors were scrutinized. Every interaction was monitored. The guise of rigorous discipline masked something darker, a training ground not for ministry, but for exploitation. The church hierarchy, convinced of the men's credentials, gave them unprecedented autonomy. No one questioned the methods. No one asked too deeply about missing students. The perfect storm of trust, fear, and authority allowed evil to thrive behind hallowed walls. By the time the first young man vanished, the machinery was already in place. The pattern, the system, and the men behind it were ready. And what followed would not be a series of accidents, but a deliberate, decade-long campaign of abduction, deception, and murder that would remain hidden for generations. Michael Brennan's final night at Sacred Heart Seminary was quiet, almost ordinary, until it wasn't. February 13th, 1848. A blizzard raged outside, snow piling against windows, isolating the seminary from the world beyond. Within those stone walls, young Michael was summoned to Father Walsh's private office, a remote chamber far from the dormitories, where the echo of footsteps faded into silence. He carried his leather portfolio, filled with work that reflected years of study, devotion, and sacrifice. To him, it was simply another evening of obedience. But Michael was stepping into a meticulously orchestrated trap. Accounts from other students later described muffled voices, the cadence of authority laced with tension, the subtle undertone of menace. No one truly knows what was said, but the outcome is undeniable. Michael Brennan never returned to the dormitory. In the days that followed, the seminary issued explanations of extended assignments, special missions, or spiritual retreats. His parents, desperate for answers, received carefully crafted letters, written under supervision, that painted a picture of normalcy. Meanwhile, the seminary's hidden network of control, surveillance, and manipulation went into full operation. What made this possible was a system so refined it bordered on genius. Every student was cataloged, every routine observed, every moment of trust exploited. The blizzard that trapped Michael and the others outside scrutiny was no coincidence. It was part of the design. The imposters running Sacred Heart had studied logistics, timing, and human behavior with chilling precision. They understood the intersection of environment and vulnerability, of authority and obedience, and used it to turn faith into a cage. Michael's disappearance was the first of many, but it marked the seminary's shift from deception to action. The imposters were no longer merely maintaining a facade. They were harvesting lives. Each abduction reinforced the system, teaching the remaining students to fear authority, to obey without question, to internalize isolation as spiritual discipline. In that fear, control became absolute. And the darkest truth is this: Sacred Heart Seminary was not an anomaly. It was a microcosm of power in its purest form. The manipulation of belief, the exploitation of trust, the conversion of devotion into a tool for domination. Michael Brennan's fate, hidden for decades beneath the veneer of a sacred institution, was a warning to any who would follow the path of unquestioned obedience. If you are still listening, understand this. The world is filled with institutions that cloak cruelty in virtue, that bend devotion to serve darker purposes. And what happened at Sacred Heart is not merely history. It is a study in the mechanics of control, a blueprint for how those in power manipulate innocence to protect themselves. Sacred Heart Seminary did not leave anything to chance. Every detail of the young men's lives was cataloged, observed, and manipulated to ensure maximum control. Selection was precise. The imposters, Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien, chose students not just for faith, but for traits that made them both valuable and manageable. Strength, intelligence, obedience, family wealth, social isolation. Each factor calculated to create ideal targets. Those who could resist or escape were either overlooked or monitored with increased vigilance. Once inside, isolation became the instrument of domination. Students were rarely allowed beyond the seminary's grounds. Letters home were scrutinized, edited, and sometimes outright falsified. Visits to nearby towns were infrequent, supervised, and designed to prevent connections that might threaten the operation. Every act of obedience reinforced trust in the institution, while every doubt was quietly erased, replaced with spiritual justification. Faith was weaponized, devotion transformed into a leash. The seminary's curriculum itself was a tool of manipulation. Latin and Greek, philosophy and theology, moral instruction, and church history, all layered with lessons in obedience, discipline, and hierarchy. Students were taught that submission was holiness, that questioning authority was sin, and that the greater good required sacrifice. What they didn't realize was that the sacrifice demanded was not spiritual. It was corporeal, financial, and ultimately mortal. And then there was surveillance. Every interaction, every correspondence, every deviation from routine meticulously recorded. The imposters studied behavior like scientists studying subjects in an experiment. They knew the patterns of compliance, the subtle shifts in confidence or hesitation. They used this knowledge to predict reactions, to enforce conformity, and to orchestrate disappearances without leaving a trace. Michael Brennan's disappearance, the first in a series of 17, was the seminary's proof of concept. It demonstrated that the system worked, that isolation, obedience, and surveillance could be combined to conceal abduction and exploitation from both families and authorities. Subsequent disappearances followed the same blueprint. Careful selection, strategic removal, falsified explanations, and meticulous concealment. This was not random evil. It was engineering. It was planning. It was an institution designed to exploit trust, manipulate devotion, and erase those who could no longer serve its hidden purposes. Sacred Heart Seminary became more than a school. It became a laboratory of power, of obedience, of controlled fear. As you listen, understand this. The lessons here are not just historical. They reveal a truth that extends far beyond the walls of any seminary. Systems of control exist all around us, masked as virtue, cloaked in authority, and maintained through fear. Sacred Heart Seminary is simply a stark, terrifying illustration of what happens when human cunning and institutional trust collide, and innocence becomes prey. After Michael Brennan vanished, the machinery of Sacred Heart Seminary shifted into full operation. The second disappearance was not a mistake, it was reinforcement. It sent an unspoken message to the remaining students. Obedience was survival. Authority was absolute. Questioning could be fatal. Those walls that once promised spiritual guidance now radiated silent menace. And every prayer, every lecture, every ritual became a tool of psychological domination. The next victim was Johann Weber, a diligent and physically strong student from Milwaukee. Unlike Michael, Johann had begun to notice small inconsistencies. Letters from the seminary delayed, edited, or withheld. He whispered suspicions to a friend, testing boundaries, feeling the tension of curiosity against imposed compliance. But the imposters were meticulous. Surveillance was constant. Subtle threats, moments of isolation, and controlled punishment reinforced their power. By the time Johann realized the danger, it was too late. On a bitter March morning, Johann was summoned to the same remote administrative wing where Michael had disappeared. The snow had melted, but the storm of secrecy remained. Witnesses recall the ritualized calm in Walsh's voice, the composed demeanor of Murphy and O'Brien, the illusion of authority. But behind that facade was the cold calculation of men who understood human psychology better than any priest or counselor of the time. Johann Weber never returned. The seminary claimed he had been assigned to a distant mission. Letters sent to his family were forged, detailing accomplishments he never achieved. The effect on the remaining students was profound. Fear became internalized. Each young man understood, without being told, that resistance was dangerous, that compliance ensured continuation. Spiritual devotion became indistinguishable from survival instinct. What Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien had built was not merely a school, but a cage in the mind, an invisible architecture of obedience. Students were no longer just learning. They were being trained to accept captivity as duty. What is chilling is how normalized this became. The seminary's teachings, routines, and disciplines masked the abductions, transforming horror into ritual. Each disappearance served as a warning. Each fabricated explanation reinforced the authority of the imposters. And while families remained oblivious, paying tuition and sending letters of encouragement, the operation expanded, gaining sophistication and audacity. Sacred Heart Seminary, in these years, perfected a system that combined faith, fear, and deception. And as the years passed, the line between spiritual instruction and psychological manipulation blurred entirely. Those who survived, at least physically, left with a fractured understanding of authority, a scarred trust, and knowledge of something darker than any human law could punish. The third disappearance marked a chilling evolution in the seminary's dark design. By now, the imposters Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien had refined their methods, understanding exactly how to manipulate, isolate, and extract their victims without leaving traces. The target this time was Antoine Dubois, a young man from Detroit, raised in wealth and privilege, with a mind sharp enough to question, but a heart bound by faith and obedience. Antoine had begun noticing patterns others overlooked. Strange discrepancies in schedules, unexplained absences among faculty, letters that seemed altered. He questioned small injustices quietly, unaware that inquiry itself was a signal to the imposters, a challenge to their authority, an opportunity to reinforce control. On a cold April morning, Antoine was summoned to the seminary's hidden corridors, passages beneath the chapel and administrative wing that the students were forbidden to enter. Those tunnels, later discovered beneath layers of plaster and floorboards, were a labyrinth of concealment, a place where reality twisted into secrecy. What happened to Antoine Dubois would never be fully documented. Students reported whispers, muffled sounds, the occasional sight of a locked door with a shadow passing behind it. Families received letters of reassignment, claims of advanced study, or distant missions in faraway cities. The illusion of normalcy was maintained with surgical precision, and in that precision, the seminary demonstrated its true power, not mere disappearance, but the ability to manipulate belief itself, to convince others that absence was ordinary, expected, even sacred. The psychological impact on the remaining students was immediate and profound. Fear became a constant companion, obedience a survival mechanism, and the distinction between faith and captivity blurred entirely. Students learned that knowledge of the operation, of its mechanics, of the disappearances was dangerous. Curiosity could be fatal. The imposters had created a self-reinforcing system. Isolation bred compliance, compliance enforced secrecy, secrecy concealed crime. It is here, in these early months, that the pattern becomes undeniable. Sacred Heart Seminary was not a place of education. It was an apparatus of control, of manipulation, of exploitation. Faith was harnessed, devotion weaponized, and the young men were reduced to instruments within a system they could not see, let alone escape. Each disappearance served both a practical and symbolic function, elimination of a problem and reinforcement of the structure of power itself. By now, anyone observing the seminary would see only tradition, discipline, and piety. But beneath those layers, the truth remained, a calculated operation in human control, one that would continue for 15 years, claiming 17 young men, and leaving a legacy so dark it is still sealed in Vatican archives. By the time the fourth and fifth disappearances occurred, the seminary had become a machine, methodical, precise, and ruthless. But the imposters knew that control was not achieved through fear alone. To maintain the operation over 15 years, they needed compliance from those who remained, students, assistants, even minor staff. The seminary cultivated an internal network of complicity, subtle yet pervasive, ensuring that anyone with knowledge of the operation would become an agent of concealment, whether consciously or unconsciously. Rules were twisted into moral imperatives. Surveillance became a spiritual exercise. Students were instructed to report lapses in discipline, trivial or significant, under the guise of religious duty. Those who hesitated were gently but unmistakably reminded that hesitation reflected sin, weakness, and potential failure. Slowly, loyalty shifted away from family, friends, and reason toward the authority of the seminary itself. Trust in God was replaced with trust in the impostor's interpretation of God. This was the cornerstone of psychological manipulation. Redirect devotion until it serves control rather than enlightenment. Staff and assistants, handpicked for their pliability, acted as enforcers. Simple orders, who could access certain rooms, which letters could be sent, who could visit the infirmary, were mechanisms to isolate victims further. The operation's architecture was both literal and psychological. Secret chambers beneath the chapel, locked rooms for interrogation, hidden passageways connecting offices, all overlaid with a doctrine of obedience and devotion. Every element reinforced submission. The cumulative effect on the students was subtle but profound. Fear, once external, became internalized. Thoughts of rebellion, questions about the seminary's practices, doubts about the legitimacy of authority, all were suppressed, often before they fully formed. Students began policing themselves, unknowingly participating in a system designed to entrap them. This is the essence of power. The more invisible it is, the more total its control. And yet, in this silence, subtle resistance flickered. Some students, quietly observing patterns of disappearance, began to piece together fragments of truth. But the imposters anticipated this. Mentorship, intimidation, and rewards for compliance were carefully calibrated to prevent awareness from translating into action. Observation alone was neutralized unless acted upon. A chilling lesson in how easily intelligence can be rendered impotent when the architecture of control is comprehensive. By now, the seminary had perfected the cycle: selection, isolation, manipulation, disappearance, and reinforcement. Each victim was not just removed from the world. They became part of a mechanism ensuring the continued obedience of those left behind. Sacred Heart Seminary had transformed from a school into a cathedral of control, a laboratory of fear, and a vault of secrets too dangerous for the outside world to know. Sacred Heart Seminary's power extended beyond psychological control. It reached into the wealth and influence of the families who entrusted their sons to the institution. Tuition was high, donations generous, and the imposters ensured that every contribution reinforced both the seminary's operations and the illusion of legitimacy. Wealthy families believed they were investing in divine purpose, unaware that their money was fueling a system of exploitation and concealment. Every disappearance carried a financial dimension. Students selected for removal came from families with means, families who could pay handsomely for education, for privileges, or simply to maintain the illusion of safety. Tuition was collected in full. Letters to families painted a picture of spiritual progress, academic achievement, and continued devotion. Parents, trusting the authority of the seminary and the church, sent money and encouragement, unwittingly underwriting a network that preyed upon their sons. The imposters were masters of perception. To outsiders, Sacred Heart appeared flawless, a prestigious institution, rigorous in study, imposing in architecture, devout in every ceremony. Donations were proudly displayed, benefactors recognized publicly, and the facade of piety never faltered. Behind the scenes, funds were allocated with precision. Maintenance of hidden chambers, bribery of staff, falsification of records, and support for the trafficking operations that would claim 17 young men over 15 years. Money became another instrument of control, as essential as fear, obedience, and isolation. Parents' trust was weaponized. Letters sent to reassure families were carefully forged, blending details of spiritual achievement with instructions for continued payments or gifts. Any family suspicion could be countered with authority, with subtle shaming, or with falsified reports of the child's progress. The operation turned faith into an economic lever, bending the will of distant adults to support what they could not see. It is here that the seminary's brilliance in manipulation becomes terrifyingly clear. Power was maintained on multiple levels simultaneously: psychological, physical, spiritual, and financial. Each disappearance reinforced obedience in the remaining students, silenced potential whistleblowers among staff, and ensured that families remained complicit, unwittingly funding the very system destroying their sons. Sacred Heart Seminary was not merely an educational institution. It was a comprehensive mechanism of control, perfected over months and years, operating under the cloak of faith and legitimacy. And as each young man vanished, the seminary grew stronger, its secrets deeper, its methods more refined, its reach extending further into the hearts, minds, and wallets of those who should have protected the victims most. By the second year of operations, whispers of the disappearances had begun to drift beyond the walls of Sacred Heart Seminary. Rumors reached local towns, families grew anxious, and minor inquiries were quietly made. But the imposters were prepared. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien understood that suspicion, left unchecked, could unravel even the most meticulous plan. They had engineered a system not only of concealment, but of deflection, an invisible web that absorbed questions and redirected scrutiny. Investigations, when they occurred, were met with crafted documents, forged letters, and strategic testimony from students too frightened or conditioned to speak the truth. The seminary had mastered the art of narrative control. Every claim of disappearance was disguised as mission work, extended study, or relocation. Correspondence between families and church authorities was intercepted, censored, and altered. The imposters had effectively created a shadow administration, one operating under the guise of faith, but serving entirely different purposes. Even when local authorities or bishops began to suspect that something was amiss, the seminary's outward appearance of legitimacy provided shield. Imposing architecture, rigorous curriculum, and apparent moral rectitude convinced most observers that Sacred Heart was beyond reproach. And for those who doubted, subtle intimidation ensured silence. Students, staff, and even some minor clergy understood that questioning the authority of the seminary was dangerous, not only spiritually, but physically and socially. The imposters' genius lay in their manipulation of perception. They had crafted a narrative so convincing that any outsider who probed too deeply was either misled or quietly deterred. Families who dared to push for answers received polite reassurances, explanations steeped in religious language, and selective information that reinforced faith while suppressing suspicion. The seminary had become a self-protecting organism. Every act of deceit reinforced its authority. Every disappearance strengthened the mechanism of control, and every letter maintained the illusion of propriety. By the end of 1849, 3 young men were missing, each disappearance executed with chilling precision. The remaining students were now fully enmeshed in the seminary's web, fearful, obedient, and compliant. They witnessed the vanishings, heard the muffled voices from hidden rooms, and absorbed the lessons of authority and isolation without fully understanding their implications. Sacred Heart was no longer just a school. It was a crucible in which obedience was tested, fear normalized, and the machinery of disappearance perfected. As you hear this, understand. Institutions can mask cruelty with ritual, hide exploitation behind tradition, and manipulate devotion into submission. Sacred Heart Seminary is a dark mirror of that reality, a place where faith became a tool of control, innocence a commodity, and secrecy a weapon. By 1850, The toll of disappearances had begun to ripple outward. Families who had sent sons to Sacred Heart Seminary, once reassured by letters and reports, started to sense anomalies. Payments continued, but responses became delayed. Letters lacked specificity, and rumors in nearby towns hinted at strange absences and unexplained departures. Yet the imposters were always one step ahead. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien had mastered the art of psychological containment, using authority and manipulation to prevent suspicion from growing into investigation. The remaining students became unintentional instruments in this control. Fear was now internalized, operating silently within their minds. They had seen the first 3 disappearances, had heard the whispers, the muffled voices, the explanations that made no sense but were delivered with unwavering authority. The lesson was clear. To question, to resist, to doubt was dangerous. This fear was subtle, insidious, and more effective than any physical chain. It ensured compliance and discouraged inquiry, making students complicit in their own captivity. The imposters also began to employ subtle rewards to reinforce obedience. Praise, privileges, and minor responsibilities were selectively given to students who demonstrated loyalty and adherence. These gestures created a psychological reinforcement loop. Compliance brought reward, resistance brought punishment, real or implied. In this way, the seminary transformed devotion into dependency, ensuring that students' sense of self-worth became inseparable from obedience. As the family's unease grew, Walsh and his cohort leveraged the church hierarchy to shield themselves. Bishop William Corder, convinced of their qualifications and outward piety, trusted the imposters implicitly. When minor inquiries arose, Walsh and the others presented convincing explanations, extended spiritual retreats, distant missions, or advanced theological studies. The combination of fear, authority, and plausible deniability created a perfect smokescreen, allowing the seminary to continue its operations unchecked. This period also marked the first deliberate psychological experiments on control. Students were observed in response to minor tests, delayed meals, subtle threats, false rumors, and controlled isolation. The imposters measured reactions, adjusted strategies, and refined methods for enforcing obedience. Each interaction reinforced a simple truth. The seminary was no longer an educational institution. It was a laboratory for power, obedience, and fear. By now, Sacred Heart Seminary had perfected a terrifying equilibrium. Authority was absolute. Knowledge was dangerous. Compliance was survival. Families remained unaware, students remained terrified, and the imposters continued to harvest lives with precision. What began as a school for devotion had become a cathedral of control, a silent empire built upon the absence of 17 young men whose names were slowly erased from memory, yet seared into the seminary's hidden records. By the mid-1850s, Sacred Heart Seminary's operation had evolved beyond concealment into something far darker, a networked system of trafficking, exploitation, and calculated removal. The imposters, Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien, had established hidden corridors, secret chambers, and concealed passages beneath the chapel and administrative wings. These labyrinths were not architectural accidents. They were meticulously designed to move, isolate, and contain young men without leaving evidence. The seminary had become a machine, silent, precise, and horrifyingly effective. The logistics were chilling in their sophistication. Students were selected carefully based on obedience, family wealth, and potential usefulness. Transportation was timed to coincide with storms, festivals, or periods of minimal external scrutiny. Letters to families were forged to maintain the illusion of routine and achievement. Any attempt at inquiry, either by students or relatives, was swiftly neutralized with authority, fear, or deception. The imposters understood that control was not just physical. It was psychological, spiritual, and emotional. This network extended beyond the seminary itself. Local merchants, minor clergy, and select staff were subtly co-opted into complicity, some knowingly, others unknowingly. Payments, goods, and information were exchanged to ensure that disappearances remained untraceable. The community saw only a prestigious institution flourishing in the Illinois prairie, unaware of the clandestine operations concealed beneath its walls. Even letters and official documents, once considered sacred, became tools for manipulation and concealment. For the students who remained, the atmosphere was one of constant tension and psychological warfare. Obedience was enforced not merely by instruction, but by fear. Fear of disappearance, fear of divine judgment, fear of authority. Every routine, every ritual, every lecture reinforced the supremacy of the impostor's control. They had engineered a system where devotion became a leash, loyalty a trap, and questioning a risk no one dared take. The disappearances, now numbering 5, were carefully spaced and orchestrated. Each removal reinforced obedience, masked by the seminary's religious veneer. The institution's outward appearance, a center of learning, faith, and piety, remained flawless. And yet, beneath the surface, a dark empire had taken root, one that thrived on manipulation, secrecy, and human exploitation. Sacred Heart Seminary was no longer simply a school. It was a cathedral of control, a laboratory for obedience, and a vault for unspeakable secrets that would remain hidden for decades. BY 1857. Murmurs of the disappearances reached the ears of local authorities and church officials who were beginning to sense that something was deeply wrong at Sacred Heart Seminary. A few daring parents pressed for answers, questioning extended missions or delayed letters. Yet every attempt at scrutiny was met with careful deflection. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien were masters of narrative control, turning suspicion into reassurance, questions into obedience, and inquiry into silence. The impostors had constructed a sophisticated system for neutralizing potential exposure. They leveraged the church hierarchy, the seminary's architectural authority, and psychological intimidation to maintain absolute control. Letters were forged, students coached to repeat approved explanations, and minor staff subtly coerced into complicity. Anyone who pressed too hard faced social, spiritual, or even subtle physical consequences. Fear had become internalized, a self-regulating mechanism among those who remained. In one notable incident, a local magistrate sought evidence regarding a student who had been reported missing for months. Walsh personally provided documents detailing the supposed reassignment to a distant mission. He presented meticulously falsified letters, schedules, and testimonials, all designed to appear authentic. The magistrate, confronted with the authority of the seminary and the church, accepted the explanations. No further inquiry was made, and the operation continued uninterrupted. What is most chilling is how seamlessly Sacred Heart transformed compliance into self-policing. Students became both the observed and the observers, reporting minor infractions, noting absences, and reinforcing the impostor's dominance. This internalized surveillance ensured that even without constant supervision, the seminary maintained control. Authority became invisible, omnipresent, and unquestionable. These interactions with external authorities did not weaken the impostor's grip, they strengthened it. Each inquiry allowed Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien to refine their methods, perfect their documentation, and train the next generation of students in absolute obedience. Fear, authority, and deception coalesced into a system of total control. By now, the seminary had not only perfected the mechanics of disappearance, but had engineered a comprehensive ecosystem of compliance. Families were placated, authorities deceived, and students disciplined into submission. Sacred Heart was no longer merely a seminary. It had become a fortress of secrecy, a machine for exploitation, and a monument to the terrifying potential of institutionalized power. The summer of 1858 brought with it the 6th disappearance. Thomas Morrison, a convert from a Protestant family who had embraced Catholicism despite fierce opposition from his relatives. Thomas was intelligent, physically capable, and unusually curious, a combination that made him both valuable and dangerous to the impostor's operation. The seminary's hidden machinery of control, honed over years, now handled him with surgical precision. Thomas had begun to notice the patterns. Disappearances that coincided with storms, letters delayed or altered, whispers among staff and students. Unlike others before him, he questioned not only authority, but also the very structure of the seminary. But the impostors were prepared. Thomas was isolated under the pretense of advanced theological study. His access to peers, letters, and information was gradually curtailed. The walls of the seminary were no longer just physical. They were mental, constructed from fear, authority, and internalized obedience. On the day of his removal, Thomas was summoned to Walsh's private study, ostensibly to review a theological treatise. He entered willingly, trusting the authority of the seminary and the tradition of obedience. Inside, the impostors executed the disappearance as they had perfected it, calm, controlled, and invisible to the rest of the seminary. Outside observers saw only routine. Students recalled a brief meeting, and family members received carefully forged letters claiming progress in advanced studies or reassignment to distant missions. This disappearance reinforced a new layer of psychological control. Witnesses, aware that Thomas had been removed, internalized the lesson. Questioning authority, even subtly, could result in vanishing. Compliance became survival. Fear became instinct. Each student learned that observation alone was insufficient. Survival demanded absolute obedience, internalized and unquestioned. The operation's sophistication grew with each case. Disappearances were timed, documented, and masked, while students continued to perform their studies, prayers, and chores under the illusion of normalcy. Surveillance, both overt and covert, ensured that any deviation was noted, corrected, and punished subtly, reinforcing the seminary's total control over minds and bodies alike. By now, Sacred Heart Seminary had transformed from an educational institution into a cathedral of psychological domination. The machinery of fear, obedience, and manipulation operated with near perfection. Each disappearance served as both warning and reinforcement, demonstrating the impostor's mastery over human behavior and institutional authority. Isolation had become the seminary's most potent weapon. By 1859, the remaining students were not just physically confined, they were mentally ensnared. Daily routines, prayer, study, manual labor, were orchestrated to suppress independent thought. Every movement, every correspondence, every conversation was monitored. The impostors had refined the art of invisibility, control so complete that it felt like devotion. Students could not distinguish obedience from spiritual duty, nor fear from divine guidance. It was during this period that subtle cracks began to appear. Some students, though terrified, started to notice patterns in the disappearances. Letters, always carefully forged, contained inconsistencies. Administrative schedules seemed deliberately contradictory. Certain rooms were strictly forbidden, yet whispered rumors suggested hidden passageways beneath the seminary. Even the most devout began to wonder, where did the missing students go? And why had no one ever returned to explain? Yet the impostors had anticipated this. Isolation was paired with psychological reinforcement. Privileges, praise, and approval were given for compliance. Subtle punishments, social ostracism, or implied threats discouraged curiosity. Every interaction was a lesson in obedience. Each student became both participant and observer, unknowingly enforcing the seminary's control over peers while silently fearing the consequences of deviation. The line between faith and manipulation blurred further. Spiritual exercises became tools of compliance. Confessionals, once a place for reflection, were used to gauge thought patterns and detect dissent. Lectures in theology reinforced obedience as virtue, while discussion of external events or family inquiries were discouraged or condemned. Knowledge itself became suspect. Questioning authority was equated with sin. Even as some students sensed the horror of what was happening, they lacked the means to resist. Escape seemed impossible. The imposters had engineered both a physical and psychological cage, ensuring that fear, devotion, and confusion formed an unbreakable barrier. Compliance was no longer merely expected. It had become instinct, and instinct had become survival. Sacred Heart Seminary, by this point, was a fully realized instrument of control, a place where disappearance was normal, obedience absolute, and fear internalized. And yet, in the shadows, some minds still pieced together fragments of truth, silent witnesses to a system so thorough that even the most intelligent could be trapped by it. By 1860, Sacred Heart Seminary's operation had reached a terrifying level of efficiency. The 7th and 8th disappearances, meticulously orchestrated, demonstrated the imposters' growing mastery over timing, manipulation, and concealment. Students were no longer just observers. They had become unwitting participants, ensuring that the mechanics of disappearance remained invisible to the outside world. The 7th victim, Johann Huber, a son of German immigrants in Milwaukee, had shown exceptional intellectual promise. His aptitude made him valuable to Walsh and the imposters, yet also dangerous. Intelligence often breeds questions. Johann was isolated under the guise of special theological tutoring and gradually separated from peers who might notice his absence. On the night of his removal, the hidden corridors beneath the chapel, previously revealed only to the imposters, were employed once again. Johann vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the careful illusion of routine studies. Shortly after, Heinrich Müller, Johann's childhood friend and fellow student, was selected. The imposters understood that proximity to the previous victim could spark suspicion, so his disappearance was timed to coincide with a community festival, ensuring no external observers could notice irregularities. Letters sent to their families claimed reassignment to distant missions, further obscuring the reality of what had transpired. Fear and uncertainty rippled through the remaining students, cementing obedience as survival. These two disappearances also marked a critical evolution in the seminary's operation, the covert expansion of a trafficking network. Hidden passages were linked to outside contacts who facilitated the movement of selected students to distant locations, often across state lines. The imposters had created an infrastructure that was both clandestine and resilient, capable of operating for years without detection. Psychological manipulation continued to intensify. Remaining students were conditioned to see disappearances as either divine will or consequences of hidden sin, a narrative that ensured internalized obedience. Privileges and small rewards reinforced loyalty, while subtle threats maintained fear. Every removal reinforced the lesson. Questioning authority, curiosity, or dissent could result in vanishing. By this point, the seminary was no longer a school, but a cathedral of control, physical, psychological, and spiritual. Every corridor, ritual, and lesson served the purpose of maintaining dominance. And yet, despite absolute control, some fragments of awareness persisted in the minds of students, a silent, dangerous glimmer that the imposters would continue to monitor and suppress with ruthless precision. BY 1861. The first external investigators began to probe the seminary, drawn by persistent rumors, missing person reports, and the growing unease of families. Their inquiries were cautious, yet they posed a real threat to the imposters' operation. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien recognized that any lapse in control could unravel years of meticulously orchestrated disappearances. The seminary had been perfecting invisibility, but this was the first time the outside world approached its boundaries with intention. Investigators were met with a polished facade of piety, diligence, and institutional authority. Records were flawless, forged letters convincing, and students coached to provide consistent testimony. Even minor discrepancies were explained with plausible theological reasoning, long-term mission assignments, or supposed academic promotions. The imposters understood that perception could be weaponized. The more credible the narrative, the less likely suspicion would solidify into action. The seminary's internal surveillance intensified. Students were instructed, subtly and overtly, to report any unusual questions or prying investigators. Minor acts of defiance or curiosity were noted and corrected immediately, often cloaked as moral instruction or spiritual guidance. The imposters had evolved beyond merely isolating victims. They were now actively shaping the perceptions of observers, ensuring that even outsiders would leave unconvinced of wrongdoing. Despite these efforts, some investigators sensed inconsistencies, the precise timing of disappearances, gaps in student records, and the suspicious absence of young men once enrolled. They began to suspect a network operating beneath the veneer of sanctity. Yet the imposters were adept at psychological countermeasures. Fear, authority, and spiritual rhetoric became tools of manipulation, causing even the most determined inquirers to hesitate, doubt, and ultimately question their own judgment. This delicate dance between secrecy and exposure marked a turning point. The seminary's control had reached its apex internally, but the external world now loomed as a potential threat. The imposters, aware that exposure could dismantle their empire of fear and obedience, intensified every aspect of surveillance, deception, and psychological manipulation. Every student became both shield and agent, reinforcing the seminary's invulnerability while oblivious to the full scope of its horrors. Sacred Heart Seminary, at this stage, was a labyrinth of power. Every disappearance, every hidden passage, every forged document reinforced a system that controlled not only minds and bodies, but reality itself. Those who entered were ensnared in a network so absolute that even the most intelligent observers could be deceived or terrified into silence. By 1862, the process of selection had become chillingly systematic. The imposters no longer relied on chance or convenience. They had developed precise criteria for determining which students would vanish next. Obedience, physical capability, family wealth, and intellectual promise were evaluated meticulously. Each candidate was studied, observed, and manipulated until the moment of disappearance could be executed with minimal risk of exposure. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien treated their operation like an experiment in human behavior. Every student was a subject, every interaction a test. Privileges were measured against compliance, fear against loyalty. Even trivial behaviors, hesitation in prayer, questioning in class, or curiosity about forbidden areas, were recorded and subtly punished. The seminary's hidden corridors and chambers were now supplemented by psychological traps designed to ensnare both mind and body. Students were conditioned to internalize their fear. Stories of prior disappearances, carefully censored yet hinted at, circulated quietly among them. Each whispered account reinforced obedience. The lesson was undeniable. Questioning authority, acting independently, or seeking the truth could result in vanishing. Faith and fear were now inseparable, and the imposters wielded them like blades, shaping behavior with surgical precision. The imposters also manipulated relationships among students. Friendships were tested and occasionally broken. Loyalty to peers was subordinated to loyalty to authority. The fear of losing a friend, or worse, being implicated in their disappearance, reinforced compliance. Every action, every choice, every thought was now under subtle, constant surveillance. The seminary had become not just a school, but a laboratory for control, shaping the minds of its young men with an efficiency that bordered on terrifying genius. Financial control continued in parallel. Families remained oblivious, sending payments, gifts, and supplies while receiving letters that reassured them of spiritual and academic progress. The imposters understood that money could be leveraged as both carrot and chain. It reinforced the illusion of legitimacy, supported the hidden operations, and ensured that parents became unwitting accomplices in their sons' exploitation. Sacred Heart Seminary, by this point, was a cathedral of dominance. Every ritual, every corridor, every lesson served a dual purpose: education outwardly, manipulation inwardly. 17 young men would vanish over 15 years, each disappearance reinforcing obedience, fear, and the seminary's unassailable authority. And still, the impostors remained unseen, untouchable, operating behind a mask of faith, intellect, and civilization, a terrifying lesson in the power of control. As the years progressed, the impostors' psychological games became increasingly intricate. By 1863, obedience was no longer enforced solely through fear of disappearance. It was embedded into the very framework of thought. Students were conditioned to anticipate punishment, question their own perceptions, and defer to authority without hesitation. Every lecture, ritual, and task reinforced the supremacy of Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien, blurring the line between devotion and subjugation. The impostors employed strategies that manipulated perception itself. They would praise a student for an action while simultaneously implying subtle criticism, creating a constant state of anxiety and self-doubt. One never knew if compliance was sufficient or if a misstep might invoke consequences. The students' internal monitors became more vigilant than any external observer, and the seminary thrived on this self-imposed surveillance. Isolation played a critical role. Social interaction was limited and carefully managed. Even casual conversations were monitored, subtly corrected, and interpreted as either loyalty or disloyalty. Friendships became fraught with suspicion, as any hint of curiosity about the missing students or the seminary's hidden chambers could be reported to the impostors. In this way, fear and conformity were normalized, self-policing became instinctive, and rebellion was rendered nearly impossible. Ritualized tasks also carried hidden lessons. Early morning prayers, manual labor, and extended study sessions were designed to exhaust and distract, leaving little mental space for independent thought. The impostors understood that tired minds are obedient minds. Even spiritual exercises were weaponized, teaching that questioning authority equated to sin, and that obedience, no matter the cost, was sacred. Yet, even in this suffocating environment, some students began to piece together fragments of truth. They noticed patterns. Disappearances coincided with storms. Letters contained subtle inconsistencies, and certain areas of the seminary remained strictly off-limits. But fear and conditioning often silenced these realizations. The human instinct for self-preservation overpowered curiosity. Sacred Heart Seminary, by now, had perfected a dual-layered control system. Outwardly, it was a revered institution of learning and faith. Inwardly, it was a fortress of manipulation, fear, and exploitation. Every disappearance reinforced the illusion of sanctity while consolidating power. The impostors had created not just a school, but a cathedral of domination, an environment in which fear and faith intertwined, shaping the minds of those trapped within its walls. By 1864, Sacred Heart Seminary's manipulation extended far beyond its walls. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien had mastered the art of controlling perception, both internally among students and externally among families and authorities. Letters to parents were meticulously crafted, offering reassurance while concealing the horrors within. Every communication was designed to maintain trust, sustain financial support, and prevent suspicion from solidifying into inquiry. Families became unwitting accomplices in their sons' entrapment. Payments for tuition and supplies flowed uninterrupted, reinforcing the illusion of legitimacy. Each letter described diligence, devotion, and progress in theological study, yet subtly omitted the isolation, fear, and psychological coercion that dominated daily life. The impostors understood that external perception could be weaponized. The more the world trusted them, the safer their operations became. Visits were strategically permitted, tightly controlled, and psychologically manipulated. A parent might see their son in uniform, kneeling in prayer, or participating in a ritual, reinforcing the belief that their child was safe and thriving. Behind the scenes, conversations were monitored, questions redirected, and impressions carefully curated. The seminary had become a theater of authority, where every performance reinforced obedience, fear, and unquestioned trust. This period also marked an escalation in the impostors' tactics of deception. They began orchestrating small, controlled losses of students to test the family's responses. Letters would arrive weeks later explaining transfers or health-related retreats, gauging whether families probed too deeply or accepted the narrative unquestioningly. These tests refined their methods, ensuring that the operation could continue indefinitely without exposure. Students internalized these lessons. They witnessed disappearances, observed the family's acceptance of explanations, and learned the consequences of challenging authority. Compliance was no longer a choice. It had become instinctual, reinforced by the subtle interplay of fear, manipulation, and the carefully maintained illusion of sanctity. Sacred Heart Seminary, by now, had evolved into a masterclass in institutional control. Internally, minds were molded through fear, isolation, and psychological precision. Externally, perception was manipulated through trust, ritual, and careful orchestration. The impostors had created a system where disappearance was normalized, authority absolute, and reality itself subject to their control. A cathedral of domination hidden behind a facade of faith and learning, BY 1865. The seminary's system of disappearances had become a well-oiled machine, executed with precision and secrecy. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien had developed covert methods for moving students out of the seminary without leaving evidence. Hidden passageways, secret doors beneath the chapel and dormitories, and concealed storage areas allowed the impostors to transport victims under the guise of routine tasks or theological duties. Each movement was rehearsed, timed, and executed with meticulous care. The operation extended beyond the seminary itself. Trusted local contacts facilitated transportation, often across state lines, while falsified documents and letters maintained the illusion of legitimate transfers. Merchants, minor clergy, and select staff were complicit, whether through coercion, ignorance, or subtle bribery. Sacred Heart had become the hub of a hidden network, moving and concealing young men as if they were commodities, yet under the ever-present guise of religious duty. Psychological manipulation intensified in parallel. Students who remained were subjected to relentless indoctrination. Obedience was framed as divine service, vigilance as moral duty, and curiosity as sinful rebellion. Witnessing disappearances or hearing whispered accounts reinforced internalized fear. Even moments of apparent normalcy, prayer, study, or conversation, were instruments of control, conditioning students to accept the seminary's reality without question. Each new disappearance was also a lesson in compliance. Students observed the consequences of deviation, whether through absence, subtle threats, or the careful monitoring of behavior. Over time, fear was no longer imposed externally. It was self-sustained. Students policed themselves and each other, ensuring that the impostor's authority remained unchallenged. The combination of physical secrecy and psychological dominance created a system nearly impossible to penetrate. Families, authorities, and even the most astute investigators were deceived by polished documentation, strategic narratives, and carefully orchestrated interactions. Within the walls of Sacred Heart, the impostors controlled not just bodies but perceptions, bending reality to their will. Sacred Heart Seminary, by this stage, had evolved from an educational institution into a cathedral of power, manipulation, and exploitation. The mechanisms of fear, obedience, and disappearance operated in perfect harmony, a testament to the terrifying potential of institutionalized control and human ingenuity applied to malevolent ends. By 1866, a subtle tension had begun to stir among the remaining students. Years of fear, obedience, and manipulation had shaped most into compliant participants, yet a few could no longer ignore the patterns. They began asking questions in whispers, piecing together fragments of knowledge. The timing of disappearances, the carefully curated letters, the forbidden areas of the seminary. Suspicion, though dangerous, began to emerge. The impostors, perceptive and ruthless, anticipated even this faintest stir of doubt. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien intensified surveillance, employing both overt authority and psychological traps to root out nascent rebellion. Students were monitored not only for overt acts of defiance, but also for subtle shifts in behavior, curiosity, hesitation, or clandestine conversations. Any sign of independent thought was met with immediate correction, reinforcing the inescapable dominance of the seminary. Isolation remained a core weapon. The remaining students were gradually separated, friendships and alliances subtly disrupted, and communication between those who sensed the truth carefully obstructed. Suspicion was turned inward. Students began doubting one another, questioning whether a peer's questions or actions might provoke disappearance. Fear had become an internalized chain, locking every mind in place. At the same time, the impostors continued refining their external deception. Families received regular, reassuring correspondence. Investigators were met with flawless documentation, and the seminary's public image remained untarnished. The contrast between the polished external narrative and the dark reality within heightened the psychological pressure on students. Reality itself was a weapon, shaping perceptions, enforcing obedience, and silencing curiosity. Yet, even in this climate of fear, the human mind seeks truth. Small acts of rebellion began to surface. Hidden notes, secret observations, and careful attempts at communication with the outside world. Though these were rare and risky, they demonstrated that even in the most oppressive environments, awareness and resistance can endure. Sacred Heart Seminary had become both a prison and a laboratory, a place where obedience, fear, and manipulation were perfected. And within its walls, some minds began to awaken, sensing the enormity of the deception, even as every mechanism of control loomed around them, ready to crush any attempt at escape or revelation. In 1867, one of the most daring attempts to pierce the seminary's veil of secrecy occurred. A student named Patrick Kelly, known for his intellect and quiet courage, began to suspect that the disappearances were not accidents or divine providence, but carefully orchestrated crimes. He observed patterns that others overlooked: hidden doors, inconsistencies in letters, and the timing of removals coinciding with storms or festivals. Patrick's first act of defiance was subtle. He began documenting discrepancies, committing them to memory, and creating a mental map of the seminary's hidden architecture. Each observation was calculated, cautious, and performed under the ever-watchful eyes of the impostors. He whispered questions to trusted peers, seeking confirmation without drawing attention, aware that even suspicion could result in vanishing. The impostors, perceptive and ruthless, soon sensed the shift. Walsh and his accomplices increased surveillance, monitoring not just Patrick's actions, but his tone, his expressions, and the slightest hesitation in obedience. The seminary's mechanisms of psychological control were deployed with precision. Small punishments, social isolation, and subtle reminders of the disappearances around him. Fear, carefully cultivated over years, became a tool to manipulate his every thought. Despite the dangers, Patrick pressed on. Using clandestine observation, he mapped secret corridors beneath the chapel and dormitories, noting places where previous students had vanished. He pieced together the structure of the impostors' network, the hidden passageways used to transport victims, and the layers of deception shielding the operation from outside eyes. Each revelation was a step deeper into the seminary's dark reality, a descent into knowledge that carried both power and peril. But the consequences were swift. A minor lapse, a delayed response to an instruction, was enough to draw Walsh's attention. Patrick was summoned to the private office, and while he was spared immediate disappearance, he was subjected to psychological torment. He was reminded, subtly yet unmistakably, of the fate of the missing students, their absence a constant shadow over his conscience. Obedience, he realized, was not optional. Sacred Heart Seminary, through this episode, demonstrated the full reach of its control. Knowledge and curiosity were dangerous. Resistance carried profound risk. And yet, even under these conditions, Patrick Kelly's awakening revealed a fundamental truth. Understanding the system was a first step toward mastery, or survival. By 1867, Sacred Heart Seminary had reached the zenith of its darkness. Disappearances became more frequent, each executed with precision, timing, and secrecy. The imposters, Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien, had honed their methods to perfection. Students were evaluated, isolated, and removed in a sequence that minimized detection while maximizing psychological terror among those who remained. This was the seminary's darkest year, where fear and control intertwined like chains around the minds of its students. Every corridor, chamber, and ritual was weaponized. The hidden passages beneath the chapel and dormitories became arteries of disappearance, while the remaining students, conditioned to obedience and internalized fear, became silent witnesses and unwitting participants. Every step reinforced the lesson. Curiosity and defiance were lethal. Psychological manipulation had evolved to an almost sadistic refinement. Students were subjected to carefully constructed exercises of guilt, self-doubt, and moral reflection. Praise and punishment were interwoven, leaving them in a constant state of uncertainty. Even thoughts of rebellion were suffocated by the fear of consequences, real or implied. Faith itself was twisted into a tool of control. Obedience equated to virtue. Questioning equated to sin. Externally, the impostor's deception was flawless. Families continued to receive reassuring letters. Investigators were subtly misled, and public perception of the seminary remained unblemished. Every disappearance was carefully concealed, explained away as distant missions, spiritual retreats, or advanced studies. Trust in the institution became absolute, reinforcing the psychological grip over the students. Yet, within this cathedral of fear, subtle sparks of awareness persisted. A few students, inspired by Patrick Kelly's earlier observations, began to notice patterns, map the hidden corridors, and question the narratives they were fed. These sparks, though fragile, hinted at the resilience of human perception even under extreme oppression. Sacred Heart Seminary, at this peak, exemplified the terrifying power of institutional manipulation. It was more than a school. It was a laboratory of obedience, a fortress of fear, and a network of vanishing. Knowledge, perception, and faith were all tools in the hands of those who understood how to wield them with precision. And within these walls, the balance between domination and awakening teetered on a knife's edge, leaving the remaining students suspended between survival and discovery. By 1868, the first real cracks began to appear in the impostor's meticulously constructed empire. Rumors of disappearances had started leaking beyond the seminary's walls, carried by worried families who noticed delays in letters or subtle inconsistencies in communication. A few persistent investigators began comparing enrollment records with the reported locations of young priests, uncovering patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Inside the seminary, the impostors sensed the shifting winds. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien intensified every layer of control, surveillance, psychological conditioning, and fear, but even their meticulous planning could not fully counter the increasing scrutiny. The students, though conditioned for obedience, began to notice more anomalies. Unexplained absences, locked doors, and faint sounds beneath the chapel that did not align with ordinary seminary activity. Anxiety and suspicion spread, not only among students, but subtly infecting the impostor's operations. The network of accomplices outside the seminary also showed signs of strain. Some local contacts grew uneasy, fearful of exposure, while others failed to follow instructions with the necessary precision. A single misstep, forgotten ledger, mismatched correspondence, delayed transport, could unravel the illusion that had concealed 17 disappearances over 15 years. Every operational failure, however small, threatened the careful balance of fear, manipulation, and secrecy. Walsh and his partners responded with heightened ruthlessness. Any student suspected of noticing discrepancies was isolated, monitored, or coerced into compliance with increased intensity. Training and obedience became even more demanding. Tasks were executed under surveillance, hours extended, and discipline intensified. The imposters understood that cracks in authority could be catastrophic, and they sought to repair them with precision, intimidation, and manipulation. Yet, even amid this tightening control, awareness persisted. Students like Patrick Kelly had left subtle imprints of observation, and new, quietly courageous individuals began to watch, memorize, and question. The psychological equilibrium of the seminary was now precarious. Any miscalculation could spark exposure, rebellion, or collapse. Sacred Heart Seminary, once an unassailable fortress of domination, now teetered under the weight of its own hidden truths. Fear, obedience, and control were still powerful, but the subtle shifts in awareness, curiosity, and external scrutiny hinted that even the most perfected systems of manipulation could be challenged. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of power, deception, and the human instinct for survival. By 1869, pressure from outside the seminary became unavoidable. Families, growing restless with delayed letters and inconsistencies, began coordinating with each other and with local authorities. Investigators, once placated by polished documentation and the seminary's veneer of respectability, now began cross-referencing reports, tracking student transfers, and noting patterns of unexplained absences. The cracks in the impostor's facade were widening. Inside Sacred Heart, tension became palpable. Students who had previously suppressed their awareness now sensed an invisible threat beyond the walls. Whispers circulated in the corridors, careful and fleeting, sharing observations about hidden doors, missing peers, and the unusual timing of appointments with Walsh and Murphy. Fear remained omnipresent, yet it was now tempered by the spark of shared understanding, a dangerous combination the imposters had not fully anticipated. The imposters responded swiftly, increasing psychological pressure and surveillance. Minor infractions were punished with precision. Friendships were subtly broken to prevent coordination, and isolation became the primary tool of compliance. Every interaction was calculated to reinforce the narrative. Obedience was sacred, curiosity deadly. The seminary had become a machine for controlling thought, not merely behavior, and the imposters wielded it with relentless efficiency. At the same time, external investigators began probing the edges of the seminary's operations. Local merchants who had facilitated transport or provided supplies were questioned. Church officials, previously unaware or deceived, were contacted to verify credentials and movement of students. The network that had remained hidden for over a decade now risked exposure. Each inquiry, each raised eyebrow, threatened to unravel the 15-year web of disappearances. For the students, the atmosphere was suffocating and electrified with fear. Every sound, every locked door, every instruction carried dual meaning. Obedience meant survival, but awareness of the outside scrutiny hinted at the possibility of truth. The interplay of fear, control, and awakening reached a critical point. Sacred Heart Seminary, once an unassailable fortress of manipulation, now faced the first real threat that could compromise the impostor's dominion. The stage was set for confrontation. The system of domination, psychological, physical, and institutional, was being challenged. And for the first time in years, the remaining students, the families, and the investigators glimpsed the possibility that even the most meticulous fortress of fear could be breached. Faced with growing external scrutiny in 1870, the imposters moved decisively to tighten their grip. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien implemented extreme measures. New surveillance protocols, secret signals, and controlled interactions to prevent any information from slipping beyond the seminary's walls. Fear, already deeply embedded in the students' minds, was weaponized to its fullest extent. Disobedience was no longer merely punished. It was made terrifyingly visible. The imposters also employed psychological manipulation with renewed intensity. Students were constantly reminded of the disappearances, the missing names and empty beds serving as perpetual warnings. Praise was rare and strategic, while criticism and subtle threats were omnipresent. Every act, no matter how trivial, became an exercise in obedience and internalized fear. The seminary's halls echoed, not only with prayers, but with the unspoken weight of control. Externally, Walsh and his accomplices expanded their network of deception. Letters, carefully worded and forged when necessary, reassured families and investigators alike. False reports of assignments to distant missions or spiritual retreats masked the growing trail of vanished students. Merchants, minor clergy, and local operatives, whether coerced, complicit, or fearful, ensured the flow of information remained tightly controlled. The operation had become a sophisticated machine of perception, operating as much in the minds of the world as in the seminary itself. Yet cracks persisted. A few students continued to notice irregularities, memorizing corridors, secret rooms, and unusual patterns of activity. These observations, though dangerous, were the seeds of awareness that threatened the impostor's absolute control. The remaining students, now older and wiser, began to internalize subtle truths, balancing obedience with cautious investigation. Every glance, every whispered conversation, carried risk and potential revelation. Sacred Heart Seminary, by now, was a fortress in every sense, a prison of stone, fear, and psychological mastery. Its leaders had created a system where disappearance was normalized, obedience automatic, and reality shaped to serve their agenda. Yet even in this perfected environment of control, the first real threats to their dominion had emerged. The impostors, for all their cunning, now faced the impossible, maintaining an empire built on lies, manipulation, and terror, while forces outside and within began to challenge their authority. The stage was set for an escalation that would push the boundaries of fear, obedience, and revelation, forcing students and investigators alike into a dangerous dance with hidden power. By 1871, the tide began to turn. A small group of external investigators, clergy, persistent family members, and local authorities started connecting the dots. Cross-referencing student rosters, transfer records, and letters, they began to notice a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. 17 disappearances over 15 years revealed a chilling regularity, hinting at a deliberate and sinister design. Inside the seminary, the atmosphere shifted. Students, sensing heightened scrutiny from outside, felt the invisible walls tighten. The impostors, Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien, responded with escalation. Inspections became more frequent, restrictions more severe, and punishments more public. Psychological conditioning intensified. Obedience was framed as salvation, curiosity as damnation. The seminary's internal reality mirrored a battlefield where survival depended on complete alignment with the impostor's agenda. Yet, subtle cracks persisted. Some students had memorized hidden corridors, passageways beneath the chapel, and patterns in the impostor's routines. Whispers were exchanged in the dead of night, notes hidden in books or between floorboards. Every act of observation carried immense risk, but also offered the potential of truth. The seeds of rebellion, though fragile, were beginning to grow. Externally, investigators began pressing for access, questioning local collaborators, and probing financial records. The impostors, while ruthless and cunning, could not fully anticipate the persistence of those determined to uncover the truth. Pressure mounted. Letters were intercepted, alibis carefully constructed, but subtle inconsistencies began to emerge, small gaps in their narrative that hinted at something far darker than anyone imagined. Sacred Heart Seminary, a fortress of fear and control, now faced a pivotal moment. The balance between domination and exposure teetered dangerously. Students' awareness, external investigation, and the hidden mechanisms of deceit were converging, creating a volatile environment. The impostor's empire of manipulation, so meticulously built over 15 years, was no longer invincible. The first true threats to their absolute control had arrived, setting the stage for the unraveling of a system designed to hide crimes that should never have occurred. The breakthrough came quietly, almost imperceptibly. A persistent investigator, Father Desmond Hayes, began to piece together the evidence in 1872. He had access to partially destroyed seminary ledgers and cross-referenced them with letters that families had preserved. A pattern emerged: names disappearing without explanation, correspondence delayed or contradictory, and financial records hinting at expenditures that made no sense. The realization was horrifying. Sacred Heart Seminary was not simply losing students. It was concealing deliberate, systematic removals. Inside the seminary, tension escalated to unbearable levels. The imposters, Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien, recognized the external pressure as the first real threat to their dominion. Surveillance intensified, punishments became more severe, and the psychological grip tightened with a deadly precision. The remaining students were pushed to extremes, both physically and mentally, ensuring compliance through fear, while subtle reminders of the disappeared were omnipresent: empty beds, quiet corridors, and whispered rumors. Yet even under these conditions, cracks in obedience persisted. Some students began documenting anomalies, hiding notes in obscure locations, and quietly mapping hidden passages. These small acts of defiance, though risky, symbolized the enduring human instinct to seek truth, even in the darkest environments. Fear remained powerful, but it was no longer absolute. Externally, Father Hayes began presenting evidence to church authorities and local law enforcement. Letters, partial ledgers, and first-hand testimonies revealed a chilling reality. Sacred Heart Seminary had operated as a covert machine for disappearances over 15 years. The very institution that promised guidance and spiritual growth had become a factory of fear and manipulation, exploiting the trust of families and the faith of young men. The first cracks in the impostors' carefully constructed facade had appeared. Their control, honed over more than a decade, was now being challenged by awareness, investigation, and the resilience of human curiosity. The system of disappearance, deception, and domination that had seemed invincible was beginning to falter, revealing a truth too horrifying to ignore and too dangerous to confront lightly. By 1873, the walls of Sacred Heart Seminary were closing in on Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien. The impostors' network, once flawless, now quivered under the weight of scrutiny. Father Desmond Hayes' investigations gained traction, prompting bishops and civil authorities to demand explanations. Families, armed with letters, ledgers, and eyewitness accounts, pressed for answers. The perfect illusion of sanctity was beginning to unravel. Inside the seminary, fear and suspicion intensified. The remaining students felt the shift, unspoken but palpable. The impostors' dominance, previously absolute, now showed signs of strain. Walsh, whose commanding presence had once silenced doubt, now displayed impatience and subtle panic. Murphy's calculated demeanor occasionally cracked, betraying a tension that students, trained in observation, could perceive. O'Brien, ever persuasive, intensified rhetoric, preaching obedience while desperately attempting to maintain the image of control. The impostors responded to the pressure with escalation. Hidden corridors were reinforced, movements scrutinized, and punishments delivered with precision designed to terrorize. Any student suspected of retaining knowledge of previous disappearances or engaging with external investigators was isolated. Surveillance became near constant, and small acts of rebellion were crushed immediately. The psychological machinery of control, fear, guilt, obedience, was deployed with lethal skill. Yet the cracks were widening. Students like Patrick Kelly had trained others in subtle observation and covert mapping of hidden spaces. Small networks of awareness had formed, sharing whispered insights and tracking the impostors' behaviors. These acts of quiet defiance, though risky, created pressure points within the seminary's psychological prison. Externally, investigators pressed for evidence, cross-referencing seminary records with missing persons reports. Church officials, alarmed by the discrepancies, began questioning credentials, movements, and prior statements. Every inquiry chipped away at the impostor's empire of deception, revealing inconsistencies, forged letters, and financial anomalies. The system that had controlled, manipulated, and terrorized students for 15 years was now vulnerable. Sacred Heart Seminary, once a fortress of fear, had become a battlefield between the persistence of human awareness and the last desperate maneuvers of men who would do anything to protect their crimes. The final unraveling had begun, and there was no turning back. In 1874, the collapse became inevitable. The mounting pressure from investigators, families, and church authorities converged with the internal defiance of students who had secretly documented the seminary's hidden mechanisms. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien could no longer sustain the illusion of sanctity. Their network of disappearances, forged letters, and secret corridors was fully exposed to scrutiny. The impostor's psychological dominion over the students faltered. Fear, once absolute, now competed with the awareness that the truth could, and would, be revealed. Students, emboldened by documentation and the growing involvement of external authorities, began confronting small but significant inconsistencies in daily routines. They questioned orders, observed unusual patterns, and even signaled discreetly to investigators. The invisible chains of manipulation were weakening. Externally, Father Desmond Hayes and a growing coalition of investigators produced compelling evidence. Ledgers showing vanished students, letters contradicting official reports, and witnesses recalling suspicious activities. Bishops were forced to acknowledge irregularities, while civil authorities, previously kept at bay, began formal inquiries. The seminary's reputation, once untouchable, crumbled under the weight of irrefutable truth. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien attempted desperate countermeasures, destroying documents, fabricating explanations, and accelerating disappearances. But the mechanisms of their control were too entangled with public scrutiny and internal awareness to function effectively. The empire they had meticulously built over 15 years was unraveling before their eyes. Sacred Heart Seminary, a place once revered for faith and learning, now stood exposed as a labyrinth of manipulation, fear, and death. The hidden corridors, vanished students, and psychological control systems were no longer secrets. The stories of the 17 disappeared priests, the calculated operations of the impostors, and the deliberate obfuscation of truth had emerged from the shadows. This moment marked not just the end of 15 years of terror, but the awakening of awareness. Even the most sophisticated systems of control can be challenged by persistence, courage, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Sacred Heart Seminary had demonstrated the extremes of institutional manipulation, but its exposure proved one enduring fact. No fortress of fear is invincible when human determination seeks to uncover it. The story of Sacred Heart Seminary and the 17 priests who vanished over 15 years leaves a lingering darkness that cannot be ignored. By the mid-1870s, Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien had been removed from their positions, investigated, and exposed for the impostors they were. Yet the scars of their reign remained. Empty dormitories, fractured families, and a generation of students who had lived under a perfected system of fear and manipulation. What remains most haunting is the psychological imprint of the seminary's control. Obedience was weaponized, faith distorted, and silence enforced. The students who survived carried knowledge of what human beings are capable of when authority is abused and institutions are weaponized. Their awakening came at a cost, yet it also carried a profound revelation. Awareness, courage, and persistence can pierce even the most meticulously constructed systems of domination. The external exposure of the seminary revealed truths that the Catholic Church had long sought to bury. Letters, ledgers, and witness testimonies exposed a network of disappearances and deception that stretched over 15 years. The impostors had manipulated perception, faith, and trust, but the persistence of human curiosity and vigilance ensured that the darkness could not endure indefinitely. Today, the ruins of Sacred Heart Seminary stand as a monument not just to evil, but to the enduring struggle between domination and awareness, fear and knowledge. The halls where young men once sought spiritual growth now echo with the memory of control, disappearance, and survival. The story is a reminder that power, no matter how absolute it appears, is never beyond scrutiny, and that truth, once sought with determination, can outlast even the most sophisticated systems of manipulation. As you reflect on this tale, consider what it reveals about authority, obedience, and the hidden forces shaping our world. The story of the 17 priests is not just history. It is a mirror of the dangers of unquestioned power and a call to awaken to the truths hidden in plain sight. If you feel the weight of this knowledge, leave a comment with the phrase, "I see the hidden path" twice. Let it anchor your awareness and mark your engagement with the truths most were never meant to witness. And remember, the knowledge you now carry is dangerous, transformative, and forever changes how you view authority, faith, and human nature.